A snobby waiter kicked a towering Hell's Angels biker out of his upscale restaurant, utterly disgusted by his blood-stained leather vest and grime-covered hands. But seconds after the biker rumbled away, the waiter spotted something left behind on the counter, an object that made his heart stop completely. The Wellington Room was the crown jewel of coastal Monterey's dining scene, a place where a single dinner service flowed with the precision of a Swiss watch. Arthur Pendleton, a senior waiter with 25 years of experience, prided himself on being the mainspring of that watch. He was a man who appreciated order, strict dress codes, and the quiet, muffled clinking of sterling silver against fine porcelain. At 52, Arthur was meticulous, his posture rigid, his uniform impeccably pressed, and his patience for anything outside the bounds of high society entirely non-existent. It was a stormy Tuesday afternoon. The Pacific Ocean outside the floor-to-ceiling windows churned with violent slate-gray waves, and the rain lashed aggressively against the glass. The restaurant was operating at a quiet hum, filled with local politicians and wealthy retirees seeking refuge from the sudden coastal squall. Arthur was in the middle of decanting a rather expensive bottle of Bordeaux for the mayor's table when the heavy oak front doors of the Wellington Room were shoved open. The wind howled through the elegant foyer, rustling the heavy velvet drapes. But it wasn't the weather that made the entire dining room fall into a stunned, breathless silence. It was the man who had just walked in. He was a mountain of a human being, standing easily at 6'4", with shoulders so broad they seemed to eclipse the doorway. Rainwater cascaded off his heavy leather boots, pooling onto the imported Turkish rug. But it was his attire that sent a collective shudder through the aristocratic patrons. He wore a sodden, heavy denim jacket with the sleeves roughly severed, layered over a dark hoodie. On his back, unmistakable even in the dim ambient lighting of the restaurant, was the iconic winged skull, the Death Head logo. Above it, the top rocker proudly displayed the words, Hell's Angels, and below it, the bottom rocker read, California. A small, diamond-shaped, one paternate patch was stitched near his collarbone. Arthur's jaw tightened. He handed the decanter to a junior busboy and immediately intercepted the man before he could track any more mud into the pristine dining room. As Arthur drew closer, the visceral reality of the biker became alarmingly apparent. The man's name stitched on a small rectangular patch over his heart was Clayton, accompanied by the moniker Bull. Clayton was a terrifying sight. His thick salt and pepper beard was matted with what looked like mud and something darker, thicker. His knuckles were severely bruised, split open and bleeding freely. His heavy breathing filled the quiet space between them. The metallic smell of ozone, motor oil, and fresh blood wafted off him in waves, overpowering the delicate aromas of truffle oil and roasted duck that usually defined the Wellington Room. "Excuse me, sir," Arthur said, his voice dripping with an icy, rehearsed politeness that was entirely devoid of warmth. "You cannot be in here." Clayton blinked, his eyes bloodshot and wide. He looked disoriented, swaying slightly on his massive feet. He didn't look angry. He looked hollowed out. I need a phone," Clayton rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding against a steel pipe. "My cell got smashed. I need to call the hospital. Please, just a glass of water and the landline." Arthur's gaze flicked down to Clayton's hands. The blood was fresh, smeared across his palms and dripping slowly from his fingertips onto the polished hardwood floor. Disgust flared in Arthur's chest. To him, the Hells Angels were nothing more than a violent syndicate, and the blood on this giant's hands was undoubtedly the result of some barbaric roadside brawl or turf war. "I am afraid that is entirely out of the question," Arthur said, stepping subtly to block Clayton's path to the host's stand where the telephone sat. "We have a strict dress code, and frankly, you are a health hazard. You need to leave my restaurant immediately before I call the authorities." Clayton raised a trembling, bloodied hand, not in a fist, but in a pleading gesture. "Listen to me, man. You don't understand. There was a wreck on the highway. A bad one. I couldn't get a signal out there. I just ran 2 miles in the rain to find a phone. Somebody is dying," Arthur scoffed, rolling his eyes. "I am sure whatever gang altercation you just participated in is very pressing, But it is not the concern of the Wellington room. There is a gas station 3 miles down the road. Use their payphone. By now, the restaurant manager, a tightly wound man named Simon Croft, had scurried over, flanked by 2 burly security guards. "Arthur, is there a problem?" Simon asked nervously, keeping a wide berth from the towering biker. "I was just informing this gentleman that he is trespassing and needs to leave," Arthur replied coldly. Clayton looked at Arthur, then at Simon, and finally at the 2 guards whose hands were hovering over their batons. The massive biker's shoulders slumped. The fight seemed to entirely drain out of him, replaced by a profound, agonizing sorrow. He looked down at his own trembling, blood-soaked hands, shaking his head slowly. "I tried," Clayton whispered, his voice cracking with a terrifying vulnerability that caught Arthur off guard for a fraction of a second. "God knows I tried." Without another word of protest, Clayton reached heavily into the pocket of his damp hoodie. Arthur flinched, instinctively bracing for a weapon. But Clayton didn't pull out a knife or a gun. He pulled out a small metallic object, heavily smeared with dark soot and blood, and placed it gently on the edge of the host's mahogany podium. The Hell's Angel turned around, his heavy boots squelching against the floor, and walked back out into the raging coastal storm, disappearing into the sheets of gray rain. The heavy oak doors swung shut, sealing out the roaring wind and rain. Inside the Wellington room, a collective exhale rippled through the dining area. The wealthy patrons turned back to their expensive meals, murmuring in hushed, scandalized tones about the decline of the neighborhood. "Good heavens," Simon Croft muttered, pulling a pristine white linen handkerchief from his breast pocket and dabbing at his forehead. "Well handled, Arthur. The sheer audacity of these gang members. I'll have the maintenance crew mop up the foyer immediately. It smells like an abattoir in here." Arthur adjusted his bow tie, feeling a swell of self-satisfaction. He had protected the sanctity of the restaurant. "Thank you, Simon. I'll get back to the mayor's table." Before he walked away, Arthur's eyes fell upon the object the biker had left behind on the edge of the mahogany podium. Disgusted that the man had littered in his establishment, Arthur grabbed a cocktail napkin to avoid touching it directly and picked the object up. He intended to toss it straight into the waste bin behind the host's stand. But as the overhead crystal chandelier caught the metallic surface, Arthur froze. It was a silver locket. It was heavily tarnished, dented on one side and smeared with a frightening mix of dark grease and dried blood, but beneath the grime, the delicate, intricate engraving of a rising sun was unmistakably clear. Arthur's heart performed a violent, terrifying stutter in his chest. His breath hitched. He frantically rubbed the cocktail napkin against the surface of the silver, wiping away the blood to reveal the back of the locket. There, etched in a familiar, elegant cursive, were 3 words: "To Lily, always." The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking of forks, the soft jazz playing over the speakers, the murmur of the elite turned into a deafening, underwater roar in Arthur's ears. The cocktail napkin fluttered from his trembling fingers to the floor. It was Lily's locket, his 19-year-old daughter. He had given it to her on her 16th birthday. She never took it off. She had even pointed out the tiny dent on the right side where she had accidentally dropped it on the bathroom tiles a year ago. Arthur's mind raced, entirely short-circuiting. Why did a towering, blood-soaked Hell's Angel have his daughter's most prized possession? A wave of absolute, paralyzing terror washed over him. He remembered the argument he and Lily had that very morning. She had wanted to drive up the treacherous Pacific Coast Highway to visit her college friends in Santa Cruz. Arthur had forbidden it, warning her about the severe storm warnings. But Lily, fiercely independent and headstrong, had grabbed the keys to her little green Honda Civic and stormed out. "Sir, there was a wreck on the highway, a bad one. Somebody is dying. Seep." The biker's raspy, desperate words echoed violently in Arthur's skull. The blood on Clayton's hands, the bruised knuckles. "Arthur," Simon's voice sounded miles away. "Arthur, you look pale. Are you quite all right?" Arthur didn't answer. He couldn't. He shoved past his manager, nearly knocking the smaller man over, and burst through the heavy oak doors, sprinting out into the freezing downpour. "Hey!" Come back!" The biker is gone. He screamed into the storm, spinning around wildly in the empty parking lot. The rain instantly soaked through his tailored suit, plastering his hair to his forehead. He ran to the edge of the highway, desperately searching the gray horizon for any sign of the leather-clad giant. But there was nothing, just the unrelenting rain and the roar of the ocean. Sirens cut through the sound of the storm. Arthur turned to see the flashing red and blue lights of a California Highway Patrol cruiser tearing down the coastal road. It screeched to a halt in the restaurant's parking lot, the tires kicking up a massive spray of water. A state trooper, Officer Brian Mitchell, threw his door open and rushed out, his yellow rain slicker gleaming. Arthur sprinted toward him, slipping on the wet asphalt and falling hard onto his knees. But he scrambled up instantly, holding the bloody locket out like a madman. "Officer, officer, please," Arthur cried out, his perfectly curated composure entirely shattered. "My daughter. A biker was just here." He had my daughter's locket. Officer Mitchell grabbed Arthur by the shoulders to steady him. The young cop looked shaken himself, his face pale beneath his uniform cap. "Sir, calm down. Are you the one who works here? Did a Hell's Angel come through these doors about 10 minutes ago?" "Big guy. Goes by the name Bull." "Yes. Yes, I threw him out. I didn't know." Arthur sobbed, the horrific reality of his actions crushing his chest. "Where is my daughter? What happened on the highway?" Officer Mitchell looked at Arthur with a mixture of profound shock and pity. "Sir, there was a massive multi-vehicle pileup on Highway 1, about 5 miles north of here. A commercial logging truck lost its brakes on the descent. It plowed through 4 cars before jackknifing. Arthur couldn't breathe. A green Honda. Was it a green Honda?" Mitchell nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. It took the worst of the impact. The car was completely crushed against the guardrail, and the engine block caught fire almost immediately." Arthur let out a guttural, agonizing sound, his legs giving out. But Officer Mitchell held him up, giving him a firm shake. "Listen to me, sir. Listen." Mitchell shouted over the rain. The driver of the Honda was trapped inside. The doors were crushed shut, and the flames were spreading to the cabin. We couldn't get to her in time, but that biker. Clayton Hayes. He was riding directly behind the logging truck. Mitchell paused, swallowing hard, clearly haunted by what he had witnessed. That biker didn't run away. He dropped his Harley in the middle of the highway, ran straight into the fire, and grabbed the doorframe of the Honda. Sir, he tore the driver's side door off its hinges with his bare hands. He pulled the young girl out just seconds before the gas tank completely detonated. Arthur stared at the officer, the world spinning violently around him. The blood, the bruised, split knuckles. Clayton hadn't been in a gang fight. He had been ripping a burning car apart with his bare hands to save Lily. "She was airlifted to Monterey Peninsula Hospital about 15 minutes ago," Mitchell continued, his voice softening. "But Clayton, he took a lot of damage pulling her out. Severe burns, smoke inhalation. When the chopper took off with your daughter, he just vanished into the woods. We've been looking for him. If he was just here." Arthur looked down at the silver locket in his hand. The blood on it wasn't from a brawl. It was the biker's own blood, left behind by the hands that had just saved his daughter's life. And Arthur, in his blind, arrogant prejudice, had thrown the man out into the cold when he was begging for help. The drive to Monterey Peninsula Hospital was a blur of frantic, terrified prayers. Arthur Pendleton, a man who had never broken a speed limit in his life, drove his pristine silver Lexus like a madman through the torrential rain, his knuckles white against the leather steering wheel. The silver locket sat in the passenger seat, a grim, bloody reminder of the monster he had been, just an hour prior. When Arthur burst through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, he was unrecognizable. The meticulously groomed senior waiter of the Wellington room was gone. In his place was a drenched, disheveled father, his expensive suit ruined, his tie hanging loosely around his neck, and his eyes wild with panic. "My daughter!" Arthur shouted, slamming his hands down on the reception desk, startling the triage nurse. "Lily Pendleton. Highway Patrol said she was airlifted here from the pileup on Highway 1. The nurse typed rapidly on her keyboard, her expression softening with professional sympathy. "Mr. Pendleton, yes. She's in surgery right now. Doctors. Aris is working on her. She suffered blunt force trauma to the chest, a fractured collarbone, and some minor smoke inhalation, but her vitals are stabilizing. The fact that she was pulled from the vehicle before the fire reached the cabin saved her life. Arthur collapsed against the front desk, burying his face in his hands as a violent, shuddering sob tore through his chest. She was alive. His little girl was alive. The crushing weight of the universe seemed to lift off his shoulders, only to be immediately replaced by an overwhelming, suffocating guilt. "The man who brought her out," Arthur said, his voice raw, lifting his head to look at the nurse. "Clayton Hayes, the biker. Is he here? I need to see him. I have to see him." The nurse's face tightened slightly. "Mr. Hayes is in the burn unit on the 3rd floor. But, sir, I must warn you, there is a rather heavy presence up there." His associates arrived shortly after he did. Arthur didn't care. He grabbed the silver locket from his pocket and bolted for the elevators. As the metal door slid open on the 3rd floor, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The sterile, quiet hum of the hospital was replaced by a dense, intimidating tension. Lining the hallway of the burn unit were over a dozen massive leather-clad men. The Hells Angels. They wore the same heavy denim cuts and leather vests as Clayton, adorned with the infamous death head patch. Some had heavy boots propped against the walls. Others were pacing with silent, lethal grace. The smell of wet leather, stale tobacco, and highway grime filled the corridor. 2 hospital security guards stood at the far end of the hall, looking utterly terrified and completely out of their depth. Arthur stepped out of the elevator, and instantly every head snapped toward him. Cold, hard eyes locked onto his tailored, albeit ruined suit. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken violence. These were men who lived outside the polite society Arthur catered to every night. Among them stood a man who appeared to be the chapter president, a broad-shouldered veteran biker with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow and the name Miller stitched over his heart. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around and run, but he tightened his grip on his daughter's locket and stepped forward. "What do you want, suit?" Miller rumbled, stepping into the center of the hallway, entirely blocking Arthur's path. His voice was deep, devoid of any warmth. "This floor is closed to the public." Arthur swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet Miller's uncompromising stare. "I am looking for Clayton Hayes. He goes by Bull." Several of the bikers shifted, heavy chains clinking against their jean. Miller crossed his arms. "Bull is resting. He took 3rd-degree burns on his arms and back, and his lungs are full of toxic smoke." "You a cop? Because if you're a cop, you can go wait outside." "No," Arthur said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I am Arthur Pendleton, the girl that Clayton saved today. Lily, she is my daughter." A heavy silence fell over the corridor. The hostility in the air didn't vanish, but it shifted, morphing into a cautious curiosity. Miller studied Arthur's face, taking in the bloodshot eyes and the pale, desperate complexion. "I need to see him," Arthur pleaded, his voice cracking. "I need to apologize. He came to my restaurant, the Wellington Room, looking for a phone to call for help, and I threw him out into the rain. I threw out the man who saved my little girl's life because of how he looked." A low murmur rippled through the assembled bikers. A man with a thick red beard near the door scowled, taking a step forward as if to grab Arthur. But Miller held up a massive, calloused hand, stopping him instantly. Miller looked at Arthur with absolute disgust, a mirror image of the exact look Arthur had given Clayton just an hour ago. "You're the prick who runs that fancy joint down the coast." "Bull told us," said some snob in a tuxedo, "told him to bleed somewhere else." Arthur bowed his head, tears hot and stinging in his eyes. "I did, and I will live with that shame for the rest of my life. But please let me see him." Miller stared at Arthur for a long, agonizing moment. Then, slowly, he stepped aside, gesturing toward room 312 with his chin. 5 minutes. He's in a lot of pain. If you stress him out, we're going to have a serious problem." Arthur nodded frantically, walking past the gauntlet of bikers. He felt their eyes burning into his back, judging him, and knowing he deserved every ounce of their contempt. He reached the door of room 312, took a deep, shaky breath, and slowly pushed it open. The hospital room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the flashing monitors and the grey light filtering through the rain-streaked window. Clayton Hayes lay in the center of the room, looking entirely out of place in the sterile white hospital bed. Both of his massive arms were heavily bandaged from the elbows down, thick white gauze wrapping his burned flesh. An oxygen mask was strapped over his nose and mouth, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Arthur stepped into the room feeling incredibly small. The sound of his dress shoes against the linoleum floor caused Clayton to slowly open his eyes. The biker squinted through the dim light, and as he recognized the man standing at the foot of his bed, a flicker of surprise crossed his face. He reached up with a heavily bandaged, trembling hand and pulled the oxygen mask down to rest around his neck. "You," Clayton rasped, his voice a dry, agonizing whisper. The Wellington. Arthur collapsed into the plastic visitor's chair beside the bed. He didn't say a word at first. He simply reached into his pocket and placed the silver blood-stained locket gently onto the tray table next to Clayton. Clayton looked at the locket, then back at Arthur, realization slowly dawning in his tired, bloodshot eyes. "Lily," the biker whispered. "She's yours." "She is my entire world," Arthur said, the tears finally spilling over his cheeks, dropping onto his ruined silk tie. "And you saved her. The police told me what you did. You ripped the door off a burning car. You walked into the fire." Arthur slid off the chair and dropped straight to his knees on the hard linoleum floor, completely shattering the aristocratic pride he had cultivated for decades. "I am so sorry. I am so profoundly, disgustingly sorry for how I treated you. You came to me for help, bleeding from saving my child, and I looked at your clothes and I threw you out like garbage. I beg your forgiveness, Mr. Hayes. I beg you." Clayton stared down at the weeping man. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the rain lashing against the glass. Slowly, Clayton let out a heavy sigh that ended in a painful cough. "Get up, man," Clayton grunted. "Get off the floor. I ain't the Pope, and you're making my head hurt." Arthur slowly climbed back into the chair, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "You think you're the first guy to look at this ink and treat me like dirt?" Clayton asked, his voice rough but devoid of the malice Arthur expected. "I wear this patch. I know the deal. Society sees a monster. But out on that highway today, I didn't see a rich kid in a Honda. I just saw a scared little girl trapped in a cage." Clayton looked away, staring blankly at the rain hitting the window. A deep, haunted sorrow filled his eyes, the same sorrow Arthur had briefly glimpsed back at the restaurant. 6 years ago, Clayton started, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "my younger sister Sarah was driving up through the mountains in Nevada. She hit a patch of black ice, flipped her truck down an embankment. She was trapped in the cab for 4 hours. People drove by, they saw the tire tracks. But it was freezing, and nobody wanted to stop and ruin their day. She bled out, waiting for someone to give a damn." Arthur's breath hitched in his throat. Clayton turned his gaze back to Arthur, his eyes burning with an intense, quiet fire. "When I saw that logging truck hit your daughter's car, I saw the flames licking up the hood. I knew she had maybe 30 seconds. I promised myself when Sarah died that I would never be the guy who drives past. I don't care if I wear a suit or a leather vest. You don't leave people to burn." Arthur wept silently, overwhelmed by the sheer, unadulterated humanity of the man sitting before him. "The hospital bills," Arthur stammered. "The skin grafts, the physical therapy. I am paying for all of it. I don't care what it costs. I'll empty my retirement accounts. You will not pay a single dime for what you did today." Clayton managed a weak, crooked smile, the skin around his eyes crinkling. "I appreciate that, Arthur, but right now I'd settle for a glass of water." Arthur practically leaped from his chair, pouring a cup of ice water from the pitcher and carefully holding the straw to Clayton's lips so the biker wouldn't have to use his burned hands. In the weeks that followed, The story of the Hell's Angel and the aristocratic waiter spread throughout the coastal town. Lily made a full recovery, visiting Clayton with her father as the biker underwent weeks of grueling physical therapy. Arthur Pendleton returned to the Wellington room, but he was fundamentally changed. 3 months later, when Clayton Bull Hayes finally walked out of the hospital, he didn't go back to his clubhouse immediately. He rode his repaired Harley down the coast and pulled into the parking lot of the Wellington room. He walked through the heavy oak doors wearing his cut, his heavy boots, and his scars. The wealthy patrons gasped, pulling their pearls and whispering. But Arthur Pendleton, the senior waiter, didn't block his path. Instead, Arthur smiled, grabbed the most expensive bottle of Bordeaux from the cellar, and walked Clayton right to the best table in the house overlooking the ocean. "Welcome, Mr. Hayes," Arthur said loudly, ensuring every snobby patron in the room heard him. "Your table is ready. What an incredible reminder that true heroism doesn't wear a uniform, and you can never judge a book by its cover." Arthur's life was changed forever the day he looked past the leather and saw the heart of a hero. If this real-life story of redemption and brotherhood touched your heart, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories.